Good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay. We were just having a little bit of technical difficulties, but we think we've got everything straightened out now. So again, apologies for the delay, but I appreciate your patience. All right, so happy 2019, everyone. Yes, I realize we're already in April, but this is our first webinar of 2019, and I think it's a good one to start with. We're a week or so into spring, and throughout large portions of the country, spring means thunderstorms. Now, those storms can generate powerful, damaging winds, torrential rain that causes flooding, like we've seen in the upper Midwest, and it could even include tornadoes, like we've seen down in the south and southeast. Now, those are all singular incidents, but they fit into the larger issue of resiliency, which is our topic for today. Now, population growth combined with unsustainable behavior by both industry and individuals make a sudden reversal of greenhouse gas pollution extremely unlikely. And since we can't compel our neighbors to change their behavior, what's left? Well, preparation. We can build disaster-resistant housing. But what does a resilient house look like? Well, it may look just like the house next door, but behind the facade, the building science is far superior. While the details vary, depending on the most likely hazards, the principle is the same. Engineer the structure to stand firm as water and wind pass by. Now, joining us today is Matt Power. If you're a frequent reader of Green Builder magazine, you're familiar with his name. But if not, he's a veteran reporter who has covered virtually every aspect of design and construction. His award-winning articles often tackle tough environmental challenges in a way that makes them relevant to both professionals and end users. An expert on both building science and green building, he has a long history of asking hard questions and adding depth and context as he unfolds complex issues. Now, before we get going, I wanted to let you know about today's webinar sponsors. They are AMVIC. AMVIC sets the standard for ICF, rigid board EPS, radiant floor insulation, do-it-yourself basement subfloor, and other innovative insulation solutions. AMVIC, build better today. The Metal Roofing Alliance. The Metal Roofing Alliance is a resource for companies and professionals involved in the residential metal roofing industry. Since 1998, the MRA has been dedicated to helping homeowners make educated roofing decisions and connecting them with expert metal roofing professionals. The National Fire Protection Association. The NFPA delivers information and knowledge through more than 300 consensus codes and standards, research, training, education, outreach, and advocacy, and by partnering with others who share an interest in furthering their mission, which is to help save lives and reduce loss with information, knowledge, and passion. Now, finally, during the course of today's presentation, you're welcome to submit questions for our guest. Simply use that questions box that you'll find on the right side of your screen. I'm going to review those questions and pose them to Matt during the Q&A time that we've set aside after his presentation. Matt, we're ready to learn more about resiliency.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Great introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to hopefully learn a few things and maybe throw me some interesting questions and comments about this category of resilient housing, which we have been covering for several years now and seems to be more intense every year and in my view, more necessary. So let's get started. Mary, are you all set with the slide presentation?
Yes, so just give me a cue when you want to change slides.
Okay, so let's move on to the second slide after the introduction. And this is just for a general overview. There are many risks in terms of resilience. We can't cover everything. Let's go to the next slide. I've put in bold here some of the topics I'd like to talk about today, and I'm not going to talk specifically about wildfires and hurricanes and what they are. You all know that. What we're going to talk about is some of the past experience and research and building science around protecting ourselves from some of these natural threats. There is a huge body of evidence, in part thanks to the fact that there's been so many natural disasters in recent years. And I've actually traveled personally to many different types of natural disaster sites, starting back in Hurricane Katrina. I visited the site of the La Plata Category 4 tornadoes, been to many flooding sites. And so I've seen firsthand what happens to different types of buildings in different types of disaster scenarios. And a lot of it, I think you'll find a little bit surprising what parts of a house, for example, survive and what parts really do not fare well. Let's move on and get started. Mary, to the next slide. I wanted to show you this map of the U.S. This is what the historic data says are the places where we should be most concerned about severe flooding in the U.S. If you notice this slide, now let's go on to the next slide. You'll notice they have almost nothing in common. And the reason I wanted to put these up at the beginning is that the rules are changing, and whether or not you're a believer in climate change, and we make no secret of the fact that we are here at Green Builder, there's something going on with our climate, and there's some major shifts where what used to be predictable is no longer predictable. And if you've been keeping track of the news and the flooding that's happening up around the Great Lakes region, you can see this is not normal behavior for weather patterns. So I think resilience is becoming a topic that essentially will be of interest to everyone in the country, and there will be no so-called safe zones. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the National Fire Protection Association has been kind enough to set some resilience goals. We're very roughly going to follow these during this presentation. Prevention, however, is one that often we don't have any control about. The only thing we can do, for example, prevention in terms of flooding, is not build in a flood zone, right? We can protect ourselves, but we can't prevent a flood from happening. The same applies to wildfires, right? So we may be able to choose to live and build in areas that are free of the extreme threats, but we can't prevent natural disasters from happening. Even if you are, like I said, are a climate change believer and we changed our behavior immediately, the chances are we're going to have decades of extreme weather events, whether we do anything now or not. Let's move on to the next slide. I did want to add the caveat that you can't build your way out of every situation. This is a shot from Hurricane Katrina. When you have a 20-foot flood surge, there is just, other than if you're lucky enough to have put your house on 26-foot stilts, the chances of your house surviving in any livable form are just about nil. So not every scenario can be fixed with different construction techniques. Let's just keep that in mind. We can only do so much, and a lot of it is in choices that we make about where we live. Next slide. And I just wanted to throw this one in too because I love this photo. This was during a recent hurricane. This is Tampa Bay. The meteorologists were predicting a 26-foot storm surge. So what happened was all of the water got sucked out of Tampa Bay, and that's what's kind of mind-blowing about this. If you look out, this bay is usually full of ocean. So instead of running in terror, we actually had people run out there to take selfies. Now, I think that just says a lot about human nature, and it's something, again, we can't control, but it's something to keep in mind, as we try to move forward on resilience. Next slide. Wildfire. We know a lot more about wildfire after the last few years of, thousands of home losses, especially out in the West. A lot of what we knew has simply been confirmed, but we've added whole categories in terms of building science. For example, if you look at this house, and I think this image was from State Farm Insurance, they have done a good job of creating what's called a defensive perimeter around the house, so there's not too much stuff. And that's sort of job number one, and I'm not going to talk about that a lot in this presentation, but if you have not created a defensive perimeter where fire doesn't have a lot of places or a lot of trees to burn and grasses and plants and objects, then you set yourself at a huge disadvantage at trying to manage or build to control wildfire. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we want to talk about three major categories of wildfire protection. Roofing tends to be where a focus area because a lot of fires actually start either on the roof or often inside the roof. Vents also are probably on an equal level a place where fires start, and often they don't start immediately when the wildfire is raging through. They might start 2 or 3 days later, and I'll explain why that happens. Sprinkler systems, in my view, are underused and underappreciated, and I'm going to show you some evidence of different ways they can be used and also how effective they can be in certain scenarios. So let's go to this next slide. I wanted to point out that most roofs now are Class A roofs. It means that there's a certain fire resistance to a roof. That does not mean, however, that a roof is fireproof. I mean, and that's where you make the distinction between non-combustible and combustible roofing. So metal roofing, for example, thank you to the Metal Roofing Alliance for some of this material, is non-combustible. It will not burn. The same is true of clay and cementitious products. However, asphalt roofing also has a Class A rating, but it will catch fire. So in extreme heat situations, asphalt, it's kind of an odd thing. Yes, the way that Class A works is it's how much time will this roof buy you to get safely out of the house. And in that case, yes, you've got at least an hour or so, even with an asphalt roof, even in a very hot situation, to get out. But you can't count on the fact that if you're hunkered down inside that building that you're going to survive. And you also can't count on the fact that if you've built a house somewhere remotely, and maybe it's a vacation home, or it's a place that you don't spend all of your time, you can't just assume if you put an asphalt roof on it and there's a wildfire that you're going to go back and find it there. It's not that kind of protection. I wanted to make sure we understand that. Let's go to the next slide. Here is probably the biggest thing you need to worry about with roofs: debris on the roofs. And this, firefighters have found repeatedly, is most people don't clear the debris off their roof. So no matter what kind of roof you have, and even if you have a metal roof, which is essentially fireproof, why risk it? Why have this kind of essentially potential inferno? And what's going to happen is anytime something catches fire around a home, it can take to flight. And when things take to flight, then we get into the next category of risk for wildfires, which is flying embers. I also wanted to touch on siding. Siding also is not equally fire resistant. Fire, in general, there is no fireproof siding. Sometimes I've seen write-ups saying that if you clad your house in metal, that essentially that's a fireproof. It still matters what's underneath, even in metal. Is there something underneath that could catch fire? And this is where this fire resistant term comes in. Even with fiber cement has a fire resistance that will hold up against high heat and fire for several hours. Stucco, about an hour, depending on the system. There's various different types of systems. Vinyl siding is interesting. Vinyl siding is actually considered a fire-resistant product. However, if you followed any of my writings on plastics, and I've done a lot of research on plastics, vinyl siding starts to distort at about 165 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning it sort of melts and becomes soft and malleable. And what often happens in a wildfire is the vinyl siding essentially sloughs off in sort of a molten glob, and it leaves whatever is behind it exposed. So it is not a great solution in a wildfire zone, because if you have anything flammable in that wall system, vinyl is only going to protect it for a little while. Go to the next slide. This is actually a video. Let's see if can you play that for us, Mary? And I can't see it, so let me know if it doesn't work.
It's looking good there, Matt.
Okay. All right. So what you're looking at, and you'll see this vinyl siding on the left starts to slough off after a short time. The fiber cement, and of course, this caveat is this is James Hardy who makes fiber cement, so we know there's always that a little bit of bias there, but this has been documented many times, is that fiber cement does really well. I did read something interesting about fiber cement, which is it doesn't, like vinyl, it sort of melts at some point later on in the process too. So it does not, flame out the way wood does on the right there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is interesting. I just wanted to pull up because, you know, we've all seen houses with this kind of facade on them. So this is actually a pretty fire resistant house. It's got some clay or cementitious roofing, it looks like, some cultured stone and some stucco. But this too is not fireproof. Now, one of the things that you'll see in this house and in every house is the windows, right? So windows have different fire ratings as well. And, you know, vinyl framed windows are going to melt probably sooner than like a metal clad wood window or metal clad vinyl windows. And there's also tempered glass is going to last a little bit longer. They've also found that double paned windows will not break as quickly as a single pane window. So there's a lot of variables when you're trying to create a facade that will be relatively fire resistant. Let's go to the next page. Actually, you can leave it on the sprinkler defense. I did want to say one other thing about cultured stone. That cultured stone product on that house, as you know, it's a veneer. It is not considered a fireproof. It's a fire resistant product. It is great for a flash fire, meaning, you know, if the wildfire moves quickly, rolls right over the house. I knew a guy named Bob Heath who has worked with cultured stone for about 30 years. His own house was in a fire. He had a flash fire roll right over the house and no damage whatsoever. He had cultured stone all over it. It is not, however, a fortress. It is a fire resistant with a limited time because it's a thin layer of essentially artificial stone. So, you know, don't assume just if a house is covered with cultured stone that you've created a fireproof fortress. Sprinkler defenses. This is a shot from a house actually in Australia, and you see there's, like, if you look closely, there's little rods around it that are spraying water. There's sort of a movement out there to introduce more sprinkler defenses to homes in the American West. There's quite a bit of pushback, and I don't know whether it's political or what the exact reason for it is. I think part of it is that the way that we approach wildfires is we focus on the problem of the wildfire, not on the problem of saving the houses, right? So the people sort of make the policies say, we need to get these wildfires under control. The people who own property there say, well, isn't there something we can do to just make sure our house won't burn? And the answer is, one of the things they can do, other than the defensive perimeter, is put in a sprinkler system. And this one happens to be on the roof. There can be, you basically want to form a defensive perimeter, not only that hits the building, but also hits the grounds within a certain ratio around the building. Let's go to the next slide. This house, for example, was saved sort of by accident. The neighbors these owners of this house had been running their sprinklers for 3 or 4 days because some cows from a neighboring farm had been wandering over and grazing away their lawn. So as it happened, the wetness of 3 or 4 days of running sprinklers actually saved their property when there was a large wildfire that went through. Let's go to the next slide. Now, that I've mentioned the defensive, creating a defensible space. If you look at this graph on the left, you'll see the red zone is burned with, there's orange, which is burned with sprinkler, and sort of dark maroon, which is burned without sprinkler. On the left where it says defensible space, there's no burned at all, right? So essentially, if you have defensible space, the odds of a building burning drop phenomenally just by creating the defensible space. If you have things that could burn anywhere near the house and you add a sprinkler, you'll see the blue bar in the middle there. That shows that the sprinklers actually were very effective, especially when there was stuff to burn, if that makes any sense. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that's come along in the last few years are things like smart sprinkler controllers that are very affordable. I think this one, Ratio, we've worked with them quite a bit. It may be a couple $100 for one of these smart sprinkler controllers. What these allow you to do is not only set up schedules and all the basic irrigation stuff, but you can turn on your sprinkler system from anywhere and at a very affordable price. You're not spending $20,000 to put this into a house you're building or living in. it's a couple $100, and then you could tie it into your existing sprinkler system. If you have like a lawn system, then really all you would need is to put a system that's on the house. You could very easily create a perimeter Wi-Fi controlled sprinkler system that could keep a house safe in a wildfire situation. Let's go to the next one. Here's another nice Wi-Fi gadget that's come along that can help you. Wireless temperature sensors. You can put, and I've seen examples of this, of people putting wireless temperature sensors, especially at vacation homes and that sort of thing, at a perimeter of their house. It would literally send a text message to their phone. If a flash fire came up and suddenly the heat jumped 10 degrees, they would get a notification on their phone. I also threw in, that's an Arlo camera, that's a battery powered remote. You can actually hook them up to solar. So you get this note on your phone, text, hey, your heat just went up on your property 20 degrees. You could quickly check in on your Arlo camera. Then you could go to your Ratio Wi-Fi app on the same phone and turn on the sprinkler system. And all this could happen in a matter of about 40 seconds. So it gives you sort of an unprecedented level of control and the ability to react quickly to a threat from wildfire at a remote location. And I bring that up because the reality is I know a lot of people do have remote houses, and this is, I don't mean to cater just to vacation home people, but a lot of people are not at their homes year round, and I think this would be a useful knowledge. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now we're into the area of embers. Okay, so in wildfires, embers are the enemy. What they found is that there's various places in a house where it tends to catch fire. One of the biggest ones is in the soffits up under the eaves. Embers, like pieces of leaves and paper and whatever, will float up, and especially because of the way modern roofs are built, often they have vents like a ridge vent. The air will actually be drawn into these soffits. Now, this is actually a fire-resistant soffit. So this is what a soffit should look like. Most of them are just simply made out of PVC. They're sort of cheap plastic stuff. They also melt. One of the key things is if you buy any of these vent protections of any sort, 1/8 inch or 1/16 inch mesh. Do not put 1/4 inch mesh in. Apparently that is not big enough to stop the smallest embers. So you could still have fire with a 1/4 inch mesh. Let's go to the next one. Here's another option. This is in the California code, I think. It's another way to deal with wildfire risk is to offset the venting through the roof cavity. So this Vulcan vent, this is kind of a cool company, this Vulcan. When these Vulcan vents get hot, they actually seal up. So there's like a special coating. I'm not sure whether that means afterwards you have to go through and replace everything, but I think even if it does, you'd still be a lot cheaper to replace all your vents than to have to replace your house. So it's sort of a self-sealing fireproofing system. So you could put one of these vents or several of these vents along your soffit area and have a much greater control of possible embers getting in. And the offset, of course, keeps it from blasting up through the roof. Next slide. Here's a problem area, and I looked around for into this one. I actually just done a renovation project, had this similar thing where, you retrofit a range hood or a bath fan, and maybe our friends at Panasonic can come up with something. I know they have like, for example, they make a plastic plug, and most companies make a plastic vent plug that would allow you to exit through the soffit from a flexible hose. But if you think about it, you really want a fire protection here as well, because that's flimsy material that these vent hoses are made of is not good fire protection. So we need a metal type of soffit exit vent there, and I could not find one. If anybody knows of one, please send me a link and I'll write a little article about it. It seems to be, no pun intended, a missing link in the fire protection stuff. Let's go to the next slide. Foundation vents. This is a new one. We didn't used to protect foundations. It didn't really seem an issue in fires, but apparently because of these especially because the high winds and I don't know if you've heard of fire nados, where these huge roaring winds and fire that look like tornadoes get swirling in these wildfire zones, and they push that flame from the lawn area right in through the foundation vents and ignite the underside of the house. So these foundation vents are fairly new, but again, a smart idea, and they have the small mesh. One concern I do have is in flood zones, some of the foundation vents have been made so that debris, small pieces of debris, could go in and out during a flood event. So if you're trying to protect from both flood and fire, you're kind of out of luck. I think you have to assess what's your bigger risk. You may not have the same kind of performance from in a flood situation, but hopefully you're not living in a zone where both of those are huge risks. Next slide. All right, and this is a big one. Think about this. Look at that vent fan, and these are in a lot of older houses, and even some new houses still use these. You know what we're looking at, right? We're looking at the end of the house, and say you've got the blanket of insulation over your, say, your first or second floor roof, which would be below this fan. This fan is pulling air through, hot air, out of that unoccupied attic space. And there's another vent at the other end of the building that is allowing the air in. So these are great energy savers. They're really, this technology is really essential in terms of especially air conditioning costs in the South. I mean, it could also be a fire risk not to have some kind of ventilation. The problem is, as I'm sure you can imagine, in a wildfire situation, this actually pulls flaming embers into the attic of the house at a high speed, and it's the perfect environment to turn the house into an inferno. So you have a couple options, way to deal with this. One is you can go with a vertical vent, because if you think about a vertical vent through the roof, it's pulling air from the living space usually. I'm talking about one that goes down like a bath fan that goes all the way into the living space, not one that just goes into the attic and then draws air in the same way. So it's a bit of an issue. The other way to approach it is to put a fire protected ridge vent along the top of the roof. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so then fire protected ridge vent. Even there are a couple of those side mounted solar vents that you could use. Anyway, embers, big issue. Okay, so let me just quickly review what we just talked about. Wildfire resilience, Class A roofs, not equal. Most sidings will burn. Sprinklers are, I think, worth the investment and really deserve a second look. Embers must be stopped. All right, let's move on. Okay, let's talk about hurricanes. I'm sure any of you who live in the coast have seen that there seems to be an increasing risk of severe hurricane events. When I say a double whammy, it's both wind and flood is what you tend to get with hurricanes. The other thing about hurricanes and that double whammy is you actually, and I've discovered this recently, you have to buy two different kinds of insurance. So it's getting very expensive, right? You have to buy wind mitigation insurance, and then you have to buy flood insurance, which is a whole separate entity. And there's a lot of expectations from the insurance companies about what's an insurable risk. Let's go to the next page, next slide. So why do some buildings seem to weather the storm and others don't? Well, let's, before I answer that, take a look at this one. We're going to come back to this. You see the house down below it that's completely destroyed. Here's one that didn't make it. Oops. And let's go to the short answer slide, which is the next slide after that. The short answer is the building code. Longer answer, the right products properly installed and the age of existing systems. Then let's go to the back, go to that next slide, Mary. It says, for example, ICFs. So that house is built with AMVIC ICFs. And ICFs are, they're a monolithic core inside of insulated forms. They tend to do extremely well. Honestly, if you look at the most severe storm damage, other than the roof being torn away by winds, it's usually the storm surge, meaning the flood waters. And there's very few things that, in terms of structure, that can handle a storm surge of any size, even a couple of feet. I mean, the amount of pressure is phenomenal. The other thing that I do like about ICFs is that they dry out really quickly. They don't need any special treatment because they don't absorb water. So there's a lot of advantages to, especially in coastal and hurricane zones, building with ICFs. And if you combine them with a metal roof, it's one of the best systems that you can have for storm resistance of even the most extreme. Let's go to the next slide. For example, this house, the Metal Roofing Alliance had a competition recently where they said, send us examples of houses that survived natural disasters. And this was the one that won. And that tree is actually, it's funny, the tree was sort of part of the survival factor. Like that thing came down and didn't for whether it was the strength of the roof or sheer luck, did not do much damage at all to that house. And this house survived while many of the homes around it did not. And that metal roof was essentially unscathed. I mean, metal roofs are, I think they're one of the most no-brainer products out there, because you're like, why would you not put a metal roof on? Like, there's not really a good reason. I mean, they're fully recyclable, and they cost a little bit more, but not when you start figuring in. A lot of them have a 50-year plus lifespan. So, anyway, I'm a big fan of metal roofs. All right, let's keep moving. Again, the caveat: nature sometimes wins. Sometimes you only have two choices. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Run, and then the next slide, or hide. And what I'm talking about, I just wanted to mention with tornadoes, because I have seen firsthand what tornadoes do. Do not, under any circumstances, try to ride out a tornado. That La Plata, Maryland tornado, there were about 25 houses I toured there, and all that was left of those houses, at best, was part of the chimneys. They were completely, some of them were ripped off of their foundations. They were anchor bolted down. They were lifted into the air, thrown 150 yards into a gully. It was just unbelievable. And the thing you have to consider is Category 4, Category 5. You're getting up to 250 mile an hour winds. If you've ever stuck your hand out the window at 70 miles an hour, you're not even really getting a sense of what 250 mile an hour winds are. So, forget about trying to build to resist tornadoes. There's a good reason that underground shelters have been around forever. In places like Kansas, that is your best bet, is just get the hell out of the way if there's a tornado coming. The only caveat I would say to that is they did do some research with those geodesic dome type homes. And there was one, I believe, and they said this would hypothetically survive one of those tornadoes. It had 16-inch concrete walls, and it was dome-shaped, and half of it was buried underground. And it had almost no windows other than probably little slots. So if you want to live like that, yeah, you could do it, but I don't think most people want to go there. Let's go to the next slide. So the bottom line for hurricane defense is we figured most of this stuff out, and it's actually in the new codes. So the Florida Building Code is actually, I know a lot of builders don't like it because it does have a lot of onerous expectations. But for new housing, it's been proven to be extremely effective. I mean, the last couple of hurricanes built under the new code took almost no damage compared to the ones built under the previous code. Now, part of that is the age of materials. Now, as roofing and stuff gets older, it does perform less well in hurricanes. So I'll touch on that in a second. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to read these to you, but these are the areas of concern we're going to look at with hurricanes and high wind situations. What do we have here? About 7 different areas of, when I say areas of concern, these are the things when the building inspectors and the insurance adjusters walk out to these properties after a hurricane, that they find things went wrong badly. Okay, so let's get going. All right, so I just wanted to throw the next slide with the framing. This is the basic, and most of you who are builders, this is like, of course, what they call hurricane clips, where you have these joists that are on top of your, balloon framing, and they're holding the roof to the frame. And let's go to the next slide. And of course, the next level of that is that you have a whole system. So the hurricane clips are there, and then you have a strap down, you know, midway through the at the first top of the first floor, and then you are anchor bolted to the foundation, and then all of the load is transferred to the ground. So essentially that roof has a lot of extra uplift resistance. This is the ideal situation. What the inspectors are finding, though, is if you miss just one of these, you may blow the whole system. So every time they go and they find a roof that's blown off, inevitably there's something that was done wrong, meaning one of the straps only has half the nails in it, or a couple of them were left off. And this is an important point. A building is only as strong as its weakest link. So if you leave the last piece of sheathing with half the right number of fasteners, you might end up totaling the whole building in a hurricane, because if that last piece of roof sheathing blows off, the water is in, and once the water's in, you're in trouble. Let's go to the next page. Okay, so I'm looking at the underside of some decking, and you see some staples coming through. This is a big problem, especially in Florida, down here, is you know, once the roof's on, you don't really know how well nailed or was it properly attached. And in the post-mortem on a lot of hurricanes, they find an area, for example, a piece of sheathing where somebody missed 6 fasteners in a row. What do you do? And you know, that also staples are okay, and they're used at a certain scheduling in the Florida building code. So it has to be done at the right scheduling. So it's not that staples are so bad. The new kind of rule of thumb, though, is 8-penny or 10-penny nails, because they have a higher pound per square inch uplift resistance. So you see on the chart, I've put the different uplift resistances for staples and nails. Okay. Now, here's the problem. You know, you've got millions of homes in Florida probably that were built before the new code that don't have the wind mitigation fastening requirement to get a good insurance plan. I mean, basically the insurance people don't want to touch them. So how do you go in and retrofit a roof like this? Well, some great research has come out recently. Let's go to the next page. On the effect of spray foam on uplift. And the total uplift they found, they did this research right at the University of Gainesville. They found that that the total uplift resistance was increased by 250 to 300%. So I did the math on that. So even if you use the sort of what we call the weakest link type staples, the 1.5-inch staples, if you multiply that times 2.5 or 3, you can get up to 167 pounds per square inch to 201 pounds per square inch, which is way better than most. It's double the strength of most nails. So essentially, if you have an older house, or you want to go retrofit a Florida house to meet the code and exceed it, you can do it with spray foam. You'll also get the benefit of you possibly getting rid of those gable vents, because your attic will no longer get hot. Right, so you could do a very minimal venting system because essentially you've sealed that roof. Anyway, the problem is this is not yet adopted into the Florida code, and the insurance people don't accept it either. So let's hope that there'll be some push to get this to become part of the code solutions coming up. Next. Okay, 24% of roofs. And so I was talking about losing a piece of sheathing. This would often happens on a gable end where you have an overhang. The wind gets up under that overhang, lifts, and pulls a couple pieces off, and boom, the whole roof comes off. Next. You may have read or heard about the fact that older roofing is weaker or doesn't do as well in terms of asphalt roofing. This is interesting because what it shows is that after about 6 or 7 years, the age of the roof, it's kind of it gets weaker, yes, but it's kind of stays about the same. In other words, it's not like a 20-year-old shingle roof is going to perform that much worse than an 8-year-old shingle roof. So I thought this was interesting because it's not the bell curve that you imagine. Really what it says is after about 5 or 6 years, we should be replacing shingle roofs. Now, I don't know how this plays out when you talk about things like architectural shingles, heavier shingles. I'm sure that the heavier, higher quality asphalt, modified asphalt shingles perform better, but this is sort of a general look at what happens with asphalt in terms of their wind resistance. Next. Here's one thing that you can do on any type of roofing. Put down an ice and water shield. This is actually part of the requirement for wind mitigation now. It's sort of it's a fallback, and that way, whatever kind of shingling or whatever you put on there, it's just common sense. Spend a little extra money, do a complete weather barrier, and it'll make the insurers happy. It'll make the owners happy if those shingles ever blow up. Next. Overhangs and soffits. This house had a porch on it. You might not know that, but the porch actually proved to be a big problem because it wasn't anchored. So when it flipped up, it took the whole rest of the roof with it. Let's go to the next slide. And these, you're looking at soffits on the top. This is like with Wildfire. Soffits are just an area that's a difficult building challenge. Hurricanes get up, the wind forms a pattern up through that soffit area. If it can get in there and get out that ridge vent or create a pressure zone in that attic, it can not only drive rain, and a lot of people don't know that in hurricanes, wind is often driven not just horizontally, but upward. The power of the wind is so great. If you think that an overhang is going to keep rain out of your house in a hurricane, then you haven't sat through even a minor hurricane. Those jalousie windows, of course, are another issue, but that's most of those are being phased out. Let's go to the next one. This is a simple fix that Flash, the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, recommends for soffits. I'd consider this kind of the low budget temporary fix for a soffit so that it doesn't blow out. And I don't know why they picked black caulk. It looks hideous to me. They could at least have used white or clear. I mean, that's just a design thing. But so all they did is went in and they caulked the areas. They essentially glued the soffits in. How much they seem to think that this would have a great positive impact. I'm not sure how much wind that would really stand up to, but it's better than nothing. And there's a lot of hurricane things that you do at a house are what are sort of in that better than nothing category, and this would be one of those. Let's go to the next one. This is one of those ridge vents I was talking about, the ones that are mounted on the side of the roof. You can see that the top ridge vent blew off entirely, the one that's right on the crest of the roof. They do make windproof ones. In fact, go to the next slide. This one from Air Vent is a hip ridge vent that is made to stay on, right? So no matter how hard that wind blows up, within limits, it's gonna stick. Go to the next slide. This is an interesting idea too. I've seen a couple builders use clinch nailing. I used to build boats, and one of the ways that old boats are held together is with, it sounds sort of primitive, but bent over nails, so you clinch them. It's a good way to put something like a ridge vent on. If you have access to it and the roof is open, or anytime you want something to stay on a building, I mean, the strength of a clinched nail is immense if it's made with a decent steel. So again, something to think about, that maybe if you're having trouble figuring out how to get something to stay, the old ways are sometimes the best. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Fastener corrosion paradox. This is an interesting one. So the nails on the right, which of those nails do you think would have the most holding power for a piece of sheathing on a roof? The answer might surprise you. It's probably C. And the reason is they did a bunch of research that shows that as nails rust, they actually get more grip. So the problem is, once they get past a certain point, of course, then they start to weaken. But up to, I think it's around 2 or 3% of the rust actually makes the nail stay in place. So in a sense, and then nobody's continued on this line of research, some older roofs put on with nails that are slightly rusty may be the strongest uplift roofs out there. So little food for thought there. Now that anchor bolt on the left, though, is a different story. You do not want rusty anchor bolts. Those are what hold the frame down to the foundation or the posts. Let's go to the next slide. They make a whole bunch, spend a little extra and get stainless steel anchor bolts like this one. They are heavy duty. They're probably 3 or 4 times the price of what you're paying for anchor bolts. But that house, even if it's flooded, those things won't rust. It'll be there long after we're all dead. Okay, let's go to the next one. Defenestration, windows, another big area in which if you build in any climate zone where there's wind, always a concern. Next slide. Options, good, better, best. So I'm going to probably be fairly radical on some of this stuff. I like window film a lot, although I don't think it's been tested enough for hurricane zones. I think it's amazing for security. I put it on here because I think it is a reasonable thing to do. For example, if you want to have a backup or plan for airborne projectiles in a hurricane, or you simply don't have the time or the money to do other things to protect, especially large expanses of glass, window film is worth a look. Rather than go through each one, let's jump to the next slide. So this is the 3M safety and security. If you want to see something kind of interesting, go on YouTube and watch them smash a window with a baseball bat that's got this 3M security film. It's pretty impressive. It does give you the sense that at least for a time, this could save your house or your outbuilding or whatever from at least a fast-moving hurricane. Let's go to the next slide. Impact glass, as you probably know, is required now in many zones, especially if you don't have shutter systems. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of impact glass because it's very expensive and it's sacrificial. Essentially, it's not glass that doesn't break, it's glass that shatters but doesn't come apart. So if you are in a hurricane zone and your window breaks in this manner, you basically still have to replace the window, although it might save your house. So again, it has some advantages over things like shutters, which is you can see through it all the time. You don't have to worry about if you're not home. You don't have to worry about putting shutters down or running down there and covering your windows with plywood. It's always there, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's just your windows look like windows. So the next one. In the Florida, so a lot of people, of course, use plywood because it's cheap. But what they do is they tend to slap plywood on, and they make it too big for the window. Like they'll leave 5 inches over the width of the window and screw it down temporarily. This is not a safe or preferred method because what happens is the wind gets under those edges, rips those screws out, and that plywood becomes a projectile that then takes out all the windows in the neighbor's house. So plywood shutters, you can be used in the Florida Building Code, but they need to be inset. So you want to inset them, and you have to have a permanent anchorage system, meaning you can't just have them sitting in your garage and screw them on when you need them. So my suggestion is if you want to do, it is a fairly affordable way to go, but spend the money on a good anchoring system so that if you have to put these things in a hurry, they're already cut, you've already got them sitting there, the anchoring system's there, you pop them in, snap, 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 and you're done. You could even have somebody do it for you, and you could just label them and number them, whatever. Let's go to the next one. And this is not a video. It looks like a video. Automating your home. I like these professional sort of storm blinds because especially when you add in smart technology, you can now, like I was talking about the fire resistance, you can control them from anywhere. You can look at your camera even and see if the storm's coming if you don't want to watch the Weather Channel. Or you just anytime send a signal, lock and load those things down, and you are done. I mean, they're more costly, but they're not as pricey as they used to be, partly because this Wi-Fi technology has made everything just much easier to access and sort of much more accessible. I also mentioned in the first slide polycarbonate, which is sort of a plastic, things like Lexan. I actually think that's a great solution. It's an alternative to plywood. You can see through it. It's something you could have on for a week instead of a day. And they do make a good point, which is when the power's out after the storm goes by, if you have plywood on your whole house, you're sitting in a dark cave indefinitely, whereas with polycarbonate, you have daylight, you can get in there and look around, assess the damage, and so on. It's more expensive, but it is an option, and they're probably a little easier to store than plywood. They don't need to, you're not concerned about them getting moist and mildewy and that sort of thing. All right, now I'm going to skip on from windows. I did want to mention, though, that shutters, I'm a big fan of shutters of any sort, including the manual ones. So, don't turn your nose up at shutters. If you're willing to do the work with manual shutters, I think they were always a good solution, but they have to be fastened properly. Garage door blowouts are another major area where houses get infiltrated with wind and water. This one was missing the center support. You can see how it's sort of bowed in. If you go to the next slide, the exterior of that, you can see it looks like a mouth, the garage, where the wind, it's funny because the way hurricanes work, sometimes houses blow out from the inside because of its different pressurization. Or they may blow in and then like rapid changes may cause sort of unexpected reactions from the systems. Let's go to the next. So this is what the sort of the structural system looks like. I think these are posts that essentially bolt down temporarily into the floor to reinforce the door. You can also get them that don't require you to do things, where they're already built and they're just they're standard hurricane resistant doors. Go to the next slide. Reinforce, yeah, like this one, I think this reinforcing system I think stays on here. Hurricane ready. So there's several different systems, but it is something that, if you're a builder and you're building in a high wind zone, it might be something that you upsell to a client and say, this is a vulnerable area of your house, and you could lose more than the garage also if the wind and the rain gets into this. Next slide. Sliding glass doors. These are all over Florida, of course. Notice that the glass on this one, the door that's on the ground in front of us, didn't break. It wasn't the glass, it was the frame itself. So what happens is you get a certain amount of flex in a high wind, and often the flex is enough for the doors to be literally blown off their tracks. They do make different fast systems. I also would consider putting impact film on the inside of these. Don't bother with tape. Tape is not, all that does, according to the experts, is break the window into larger pieces so that you have larger shards of glass when it ultimately breaks. Whereas, impact film would actually hold the glass together. And this is a great use for it, I think, on the interior of sliding glass doors. Next slide. Okay, so you've encountered the flood. Now you have the aftermath. It's interesting. Most basic flood insurance, the stuff that most people have, only gives you about $20,000 in compensation. It doesn't cover your house. It's only a couple $100 a year, but you're getting 20 grand basically to clean up the mess. So what are you going to do with that 20 grand? Let's go to the next one. This early warning system. So I call thermostats early warning systems. Go to the next slide and I'll tell you why. Smart thermostats, especially because typically in a storm you've left your house and you don't know what's going on. You don't know if the house still has power. You don't know, how much flooding there was, etc. If you already have one of these Wi-Fi smart thermostats, you can at least get a basic sense of what's going on just by logging into your thermostat app. Find out if it's still working, right? Is the power on? What's the humidity in the room? And if you still have control out of it and you still have power, can you operate the air conditioner, which would dehumidify? I would combine this probably with a camera system, and I'll touch on that again in a second. So being able to get an eye on your property, especially say all the phone lines are down and there's no access like there was in the Keys. People had to wait weeks to get back to their properties down there. Wouldn't it be great to be able to, have a camera and or a couple devices that could give you a reading on what happened to my house? Go to the next slide. Here's the problem too: is once that storm has hit, the mold is starting to grow. So FEMA says it'll start within 24 to 48 hours of water exposure. That means even if the water clears out, you have a very limited time to dry that place out. You need to somehow you need to get control of that property. And, the best thing is if you can get dehumidification, obviously spray it down and get a dehumidifier going. The faster you can do that, the less the long-term potential for mold growth, which can really amplify your cost and the pain of the event. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to lose your power, so you need a backup power system. Now, you could do a generator. Kohler makes some nice, gas generators, but I also like the idea of solar, and Tabuchi Electric works with Jinko, and they do this emergency solar system. It only gives you 3 or 4 hours of solar, but it might be enough at least to give you an eyes on the scene of what's going on and to run a few basic systems. The fossil fuel power generators are a little concerning because no one's there to monitor them. There could be damage, there could be gas leaking, that sort of thing. It really depends how secure you think you can make those. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an interesting new product that's only been around a couple of years. There are now solar air conditioners that work without a grid connection. This is one of the only models that I know of so far, although I've been asking a lot of the other big companies if they would come out with one. I think this is the wave of the future. They work on a variable speed. So essentially, if it's sunny out, this thing can run and not only cool, but dry out your building. I think having an emergency backup of one of these systems would be a great idea, especially if you have a house in a remote area that, maybe especially vulnerable to hurricanes and flooding, that sort of thing that you might not be able to get to. It's a good fallback position. Let's go to the next slide. Here's another thing though, right? There's no power. You've got electricity, but you've got no Wi-Fi. Here, I've gone around and around on how to do this affordably. It has to be cellular or satellite, right? But satellites are going to probably be lost. Let's assume that there's any cellular service in the area. And one of the things that will happen is usually the authorities will try to get cellular up as quickly as possible. If you get one of these T-Mobile or any brand of hotspot, usually they have some pretty affordable plans. Like you can get a monthly T-Mobile plan with 2 gigs of data for $20 a month. You could run a home Wi-Fi system on a solar battery with, you could run one of these hotspots on a solar battery. That would essentially allow you to run something like an Arlo camera, your thermostat, any number of systems. Now, do you have enough power to power an AC? Not unless you have a DC powered unit, but at least you get a camera. You can look at what's going on. You can find out how much damage there were. You also could turn on, for example, a ventilating fan, keeping air moving through the building until you can get there for a few days. It might make all the difference in whether that building is completely destroyed by mold or not. And this is a solar roof-powered vent. This is an option, and this might just come on automatically. But again, thinking out of the box a little bit, how do you keep air moving through that building after the storm? Keep the damage down to the point where you don't have a total loss, where it's essentially you're going to do some replacing and fixing, but you'll still have a house. Go to the next page. Flood-resistant materials. When you do rebuild it right. And there's a lot of different stuff you can do. Go to the next page. This is a sketch showing, for example, somebody who had a flood, up to about the 2-foot level in their house. What can you do? You can use different tile on the floor. You can use wainscoting. They actually even make plastic-based wainscoting materials. And you may choose to either spray foam or not insulate at all that lower interior wall partition. And while you have it open, are there things you can do to treat it, for example, with like a borate substance or something to keep mold growth from occurring should you have another flood? Let's go to the next page. Here's a new product I really like. This isn't the only brand. In fact, I'm not even sure how this brand is doing. I know it's coming on strong. It's magnesium oxide. It's a replacement for things like drywall. It won't grow mold. It doesn't, get wet and waterlogged. It's inorganic. It's a great sort of new category of product. Some people are building structural insulated panels with it too, I believe. But it's a little bit hard to find right now, but look for MGO board, and I would highly recommend replacing, if you have any drywall in a house, especially if it's not a blue board or a green board, water resistant drywall. Now is the time to replace that section with some of this MGO board and have an easily cleanable, flood resistant surface. Next slide. VersaDry is I think we gave them an award at some point because it's just a simple little system. What it is it allows you to keep, if you are using drywall or something that is susceptible to moisture, it just keeps it off the ground a little bit, especially in a basement, and allows it to dry out naturally. Things that are in contact with concrete, which is always wicking water, are never going to dry out. So this is a way to get things up off the ground. Next slide. And I just want to make this one point, which I hadn't realized till recently. When you do have a flood loss or an insurance or a hurricane loss, a lot of people forget this. They just sort of throw their hands up and they say, all is lost. You actually can deduct it. So you can, and I'm not saying that's the best scenario, but it's a lot better than nothing to be able to say, yes, I lost $40,000 worth of value on this property. That does at least soften the blow a little bit. And it's the insurance journal people themselves that point out that many people don't take this deduction. So don't forget that one of the few sort of silver linings of this kind of loss is it is tax deductible. Next slide. And the next slide, thank you. This is our last slide. I just wanted to show you these stilt houses because these stilt houses, I think they're kind of ugly and gawky, but they do hold up incredibly well, and they can take almost any kind of beating. There's some that are out in Biscayne Bay. I don't know if they're still there, but a couple of years ago they were. They've been there for like 40 years. It is a very time-tested, proven way of building on the coast. A lot of people don't want to live that way, but if it's between that and losing your house, it might be something worth considering. And that's pretty much all I wanted. I know I covered a lot of ground there, but I hope everybody got something of value out of today's webinar. I really, as you can see, I'm kind of a geek. I really enjoy, delving into building science and looking at how we can make buildings that are, safer, easier to clean up, and more resilient. So I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody wants to send them into Mike, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Matt. I do have a couple of questions here. I know we're past our time, but if you can just stick with us, and as Matt said, go ahead and send in your questions using that questions box, and we will get to them post haste. The first question we had was there was no mention of the IBHS Fortified program. Did you want to say anything about their program at all?
Yeah, it is a great program. It's a clearinghouse for this kind of information. It definitely, especially if you're considering building in a high-risk area, I would definitely check out their website and get some information. And I think you'll find that pretty much everything, most of what I said today, jibes exactly with the kind of research and stuff that they're doing. So, yeah, great organization. Definitely recommend working with them and using them as a resource.
And also wanted to address a couple people had asked if the slides were going to be available afterward, and they will be. Green Building Media will be sending out an email to registrants post-webinar, so those will be available. Thomas had a couple questions. He builds in coastal North Carolina, and he says what they're doing down there is they're completely sealing crawl spaces and attics. And it really solves a lot of issues that they have down there. And so one of his questions was, what about completely sealing the soffits and the ridges with closed cell foam to just keep everything out? Water, embers, wind, all this sort of stuff. He feels that completely sealing the attic is structurally better and keeps, like I said, the water and the sparks from entering.
I 100% agree with him. There's the part of the problem is that a lot of the building codes, require ventilation, although building codes are starting to smarten up on this. But, and Joe Steberek over at Building America has done a ton of work on the unvented attics. But I think that's exactly how I would building a coastal home. I would seal the entire attic space with closed cell foam. In fact, I wouldn't really have an attic space. I'd just turn it into living space. One thing I would add, though, that maybe he's already doing this, is there is a lot of the only concern with spray foam on the underside of decks has been that moisture could get in there. Say there's some kind of a leak or through a fastener penetration and cause the sheathing above the spray foam to rot somehow. My other thing I wonder about it is the roof could get very hot, and heat shortens the lives of building materials. So one suggestion that, and maybe he's already doing this, would be to use some of the baffle systems, and they make some for spray foam that go right down sort of in the corner of your eaves. They're curved baffles, and leave a baffle space above the spray foam just with a PVC pan, one of those PVC lightweight panels, so you have airflow just below the roof deck all the way out to let out some of that heat and also to let it dry. I mean, that's the only, but you're still keeping your space completely sealed. So that's a whole separate, almost like a cooling system. That'd be my only suggestion.
I think you talked a little bit about ductwork earlier, and John mentioned that there's an aluminum flex duct that he feels is more robust than corrugated duct. Do you familiar with that product?
I agree. Yes, and I agree. That's what I would use, especially in the soffit areas. Any place where it could be exposed, especially to embers, I would use the aluminum or the heavier gauge material. Definitely over that sort of papery thin stuff. I've seen some tests of that, the papery stuff, and it just doesn't hold up to flame.
Speaking of embers, I had a question for you, and that was, what new lessons, if any, were learned from the California wildfires that we saw over the past 6 to 10 months?
Well, there was one interesting one, which was there was a couple. It was a famous story. This couple decided to stay behind at their property, and they got the hoses out, and they essentially went around and they cherry picked the embers. So what they did is every time they'd see a little ember starting up, they'd spray it down with the hose, right? So they were vigilant, and they didn't have a sprinkler system. And they actually saved their house, and I think they saved their neighbor's house too, and every other house in the neighborhood burned. And you could take the wrong moral from that story, which is you should stay behind in a wildfire, which is not what we want to say. But what was interesting to me is that's, again, the argument for sprinklers, whereas I think if you could be in a remote location looking through your camera, right, with your Wi-Fi app and turning on your sprinklers and doing the same thing, that would be a major step forward. So water in the right places at the right time works, I guess, is what came out of that story. We just got to figure out how to make sure more people, have the ability to turn the water on when something's coming their way.
We have one last question, and then we'll wrap it up for today. And it goes back to Thomas. We were talking about the window film and the impact resistance. Okay. Thomas said that the film is good for the initial hit and the breakage. He said the problem comes with the buffeting after the break. So he's looking forward to talking with you more about impact windows.
That's a good, that was my concern too. I mean, I love that was my concern about the window film, is what happens once the window is shattered and then there's water, because you attach them, a lot of them, with like a water solution. So once there's water, that's getting into the system, how long would they really last? I don't know if I haven't seen any research showing that they last long enough to protect you through a whole hurricane. That's my caveat on that. That's why I'd say they're probably better for security of a guy trying to break in your house than for a serious first line of defense for a hurricane.
We do have one last question from Barry. He wanted to know why there was no mention of steel structural materials for creating a resilient structure. He's thinking back to some of the photos you showed. He said that his family built a home in the 50s with structural steel I-beams and channels that he feels will last well into the future.
Well, there is one of the things that steel is not, it depends what's around the steel. One of the things about steel is, as it gets hot, it becomes bendable. And this is one of the things that firefighters ran into a few years back with trusses. And it's one of the biggest concerns firefighters have when they drop into a roof that's on fire, like if they're trying to put out an attic fire. The trusses, it's not the wood that's the first thing to go. It's the metal cleats that and they don't burn, they get soft, right? And so the whole roof can collapse when the metal cleats let go. So metal, certainly metal is a fireproof material. And I would say for, like interior wall assemblies and stuff, it's probably great. The question becomes more of an engineering one is it would have to be a certain thickness, and it depends on the flammable materials around it, on what the fire rating would be. And probably the biggest issue would be the roof. Like, what is and it's not for me to answer, it's for an engineer to answer. But a steel framed building, and I'll just say this in general, is not necessarily inherently more fireproof or fire safe than a wood framed building. It depends on where the hot spots are going to be, how fast is that steel going to heat up, what are the connections like. There's a lot of variables in there, but certainly steel is a great system. It's certainly equivalent with wood in terms of you could certainly make a very safe fire and hurricane safe house with steel. It's all in the details of the engineering.
All right, I don't see any other questions, so I want to thank you for joining us today, Matt. Really appreciate the information and the wonderful questions as well from our audience. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to AMVIC, the Metal Roofing Alliance, and the National Fire Protection Association for their generous sponsorship. Now, we're going to be right back here 1 week from today. That's right, Wednesday, April 10th. We'll be talking about... Hold on. We'll be talking about the fundamentals of demand-side energy management with Javid Butler. I hope you can join us at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's next Wednesday, April 10th. Until then, enjoy National Burrito Day tomorrow. So long, everybody.